Hey everyone. So I was looking through papers for ergothioneine content in mushrooms, and I came across this paper, which shows that mushrooms have lovastatin. Now, for those who don't know, lovastatin is a prescribed medication that lowers LDL, which is what we'll see here. So in this plot, we've got the LDL reduction from baseline on the y-axis plotted against the DDD, or defined daily dose, on the x. And I'll have more about what that means and how it was defined later in the video. So on this plot, we have 4 different statins, including lovastatin, which is highlighted in yellow. And then when plotting the trend line for each of these 4 statins, we can see that as statin levels are increased or people eat higher levels of statins, LDL is correspondingly reduced. So this isn't new. Everybody knows statins reduce LDL, which then raises the question of what's optimal for LDL, because I can hear some of you already saying, well, lower LDL at older ages is bad for health. It's associated with an increased all-cause mortality risk, so higher is better. But I'm going to present data why I don't think that's true, at least part of the story for why I don't think that's true, which is what we'll see here. So on the y-axis, we've got the average LDL concentration plotted against age. And this study included almost 15 million non-statin users. So first, we can see that LDL levels are relatively low in youth, with average values around 95 for women and about 85 for men. But then note that LDL levels start to increase all the way up into around 50 to 60, where it peaks. And then notice something interesting. LDL starts to decline. And this is part of the reason for why people who have low LDL at older ages may have an increased all-cause mortality risk, because this is a part of the aged phenotype. And when you compare them against people who are maybe a little bit younger, who have higher levels of LDL, then those people survive better. But those studies are missing the appropriate control group, which is a young group who has relatively low levels of LDL, because that's the average value. Average values for LDL are low in youth. Now, note that this plot only goes up to 88 years. What happens to LDL at older than 88 years? I mean, someone could make the argument that if you look at the slopes of the lines after 50 to 60 years for LDL on this plot, it's pretty flat. Some may say, well, LDL doesn't decline after 50 to 60, but let's see if that's true. And that's what we'll see here. In this study too, we've also got LDL on the y-axis plotted against age on the x. But this time, the age range goes all the way up to around 110 years. And here too, even though it's a relatively smaller study of only around 1,500 people relative to the study on the left, which had almost 15 million people, we can see that LDL declines all the way from 50 up to 110 years old. So these data together, they show some interesting things. First, that low LDL is found in youth, but also at advanced ages, which then raises the question of how can we know if low LDL is youthful or aged? And to address that and other questions, I have a new Patreon tier dedicated specifically to what's optimal for biomarkers, which includes that LDL story. And I'm sure there's some of you who are now on your favorite LLM who've gone and asked it what's optimal for LDL because it's low in youth and it's low at older ages. So I've actually collected all of that data. It's in video format, almost 2.5 hours of video content. And in addition to LDL, it includes these other 36 biomarkers shown here, 62 published references. So if you're interested in that, check it out. But we came here to talk about mushrooms. And that's because mushrooms contain lovastatin, which is what we'll see here. So on the left, we've got a whole bunch of different mushroom species. And then on the right, we've got their lovastatin content. The first obvious question is which mushrooms have the highest content of lovastatin? And that's true for oyster mushrooms at 606.5 milligrams per kilogram dry weight. Oyster mushrooms aren't bad. I've eaten them in the past, but I find them hard to eat in very high amounts. In contrast, my favorite for mushrooms is white button or even baby bella, which are very similar to white button mushrooms. So white button mushrooms, as shown here, are in second place for lovastatin content at 565 milligrams per kilogram dry weight. But note that mushrooms are sold fresh, not dry. And within that context, 1 gram dry weight is approximately equal to 10 grams wet weight, which means that we'd have to divide white button mushrooms' lovastatin content of 565 milligrams per kilogram dry weight, divide that by 10 to get its fresh weight amount, which would be then about 56 milligrams per kilogram. Now, I eat a lot of mushrooms, or for almost every blood test, I've eaten a lot of mushrooms, with an intake range that's gone from no mushrooms, but all the way up to around an average of 300 grams of mushrooms per day. Based on that mushroom intake range, or my highest level of mushroom intake that corresponds to any blood test going back to 2015, the highest amount of lovastatin that I've consumed would be 17 milligrams per day, which then raises the question of what's the expected LDL reduction from eating that many mushrooms that contain 17 milligrams of lovastatin per day. For that, we'll pull up our graph again. Remember, this is the LDL reduction from baseline against the defined daily dose. And in this study, that defined daily dose of 1 or equal to 1 was 40 milligrams of lovastatin, which means that my highest intake of mushrooms and potentially up to 17 milligrams of lovastatin per day would be a defined daily dose of 0.4. Now, to plot that on this chart, we need to take the data for lovastatin, which is in yellow, put up its trend line, and then put up a line at a defined daily dose of 0.4, which I've done there with the red line. And then based on extrapolation of the trend line, we could expect to see an LDL reduction of about 28% if I'm getting about 17 milligrams on average lovastatin per day. But rather than a predicted decrease, which is what we'd expect based on what I've shown you so far, we can see if it may actually be true. And that's because I have tracked data for mushroom intake versus LDL going back to 2018. And for those who are familiar with the channel, I've been tracking my diet since 2015. Including macro and micronutrients, and it wasn't until 2018, unfortunately, when I decided to start tracking individual food amounts in my spreadsheet. Now we're going to take a look at the plot for LDL versus mushrooms over that time span, 2018 to 2026, as I have 53 blood tests over that span, which is what we'll see here, with LDL on the y-axis and then the average daily mushroom intake plotted on the x. But then again, as I mentioned, how am I able to evaluate correlations as shown here, mushrooms versus LDL, and other biomarkers? So for those who may be unfamiliar or new to the channel, let's do a quick sidestep and take a look at that approach, which involves calculating correlations for diet and supplements, but also other factors like body weight, which will be important for other videos, with biomarkers. Since 2015, I've weighed almost all of my food. This is more than 99% of all food with a food scale. And I've said this before in other videos, but I didn't put that singular almond on that food scale. That's a stock photo. I wouldn't do that. It's pretty silly. But that's the exact food scale that I have for anyone who's interested. And I'm not sponsored or affiliated by them. At least 99% of all food. I almost never eat out. I'm not a fan of eating out. I'm generally underwhelmed if I eat out because first, I don't know what's in it. Second, I eat in big volumes, so restaurants will give generally less food. I mean, if I ask for a full plate of broccoli, they'll give me like a couple little florets, whereas I'm a volume eater, I can eat a few hundred grams. And then I take that data and I enter it into a diet tracking app, specifically Chronometer. And I'm not here to say Chronometer is the best. There are lots of diet tracking apps these days. This is what I've used going back to 2015. And if you want to use Chronometer too, there's a discount link in the video's description. I then take the Chronometer data, including macro and micronutrients and the individual food amounts, and I put that into a spreadsheet. So now each blood test can have a corresponding average dietary intake. In other words, if there's 50 days in between tests, I take the average dietary intake for those 50 days, and that lines up with the blood test data. So now every blood test has a corresponding average intake, and then with at least 2 tests, you can look at differences between those 2 tests, and then if you have 3 tests, you can start calculating correlations. So that's how I'm able to see correlations for mushrooms versus LDL or any food or any macro or micronutrient with any biomarker that I'm tracking. And in terms of that correlation, we can see its correlation coefficient is relatively strong. Anything less than negative 0.7 is considered a strong correlation. So it's negative 0.71. So this correlation for mushrooms versus LDL is technically a strong correlation. And we can see that the p-value is less than 0.05 at 2 times 10 to the negative 9th power. Now note that of all correlations, macro and micronutrients in foods, mushrooms are the top food for its correlation with LDL. But if you want to see the full list, I have a specific Patreon tier, a biomarker correlations tier, where I post all of those correlations. So if you're interested in that, check it out. What these data suggest, what the plot suggests, is that when I've eaten no mushrooms, and you can see each of those dots correspond to a blood test when I ate no mushrooms for the period that preceded it. And when I say period that preceded it, I mean test to test. So if there are 50 days in between tests, that's a 50-day average. If there are 30 days or 60 days, for all of those tests with no mushrooms, average LDL, 96 milligrams per deciliter. In contrast, at my highest intake of mushrooms, around 300 grams per day, LDL was close to its lowest at 67 milligrams per deciliter. So then if we divide these two values, 67 by 96, we get a 30% lower LDL at my highest intake of mushrooms, which isn't too far from that predicted amount based on lovastatin content. Now, is that because of lovastatin content in mushrooms? I don't know. Could be that. Could be fiber. Fiber's been shown to reduce LDL. It could be niacin. Mushrooms are a rich source of niacin. So it could be lots of factors, But if the goal is to reduce LDL, and we're considering that mushrooms, specifically white button mushrooms, oyster mushrooms, and a whole bunch of other mushrooms contain lovastatin, if you're looking for probably the lowest risk approach relative to taking a prescribed medication to lower your LDL, mushrooms may be the way to go. If you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon, where I offer blood test consults and also post at least twice per day in 4 other Patreon tiers. We've also got a whole bunch of discount and affiliate links that you can use to test yourself that help support the channel, including ultralabtests.com, which is where I get the majority of my blood tests done, Life Extension, and I included that originally to use a different lab because ultralabtests.com uses Quest. In the past, Life Extension used LabCorp, but I guess they're using Quest now too. But they have different tests. They're not exactly the same test. So if you're into blood testing like me and you want to help support the channel and you use either Ulta or Life Extension, greatly appreciate it. At-home metabolomics, NAD testing with Ginfinity, epigenetic testing with True Diagnostic, at-home blood testing with SciFox Health, which includes GrimAge, the best epigenetic clock of epigenetic clocks, oral microbiome composition, diet tracking with Chronometer, green tea, the clearly filtered water filter, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that with the website Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got merch, including new merch. The Health and Longevity Optimizer is shown here, but also Data is my North Star, which I've got on there. Figuring Stuff Out is my drug, and the ConquerAging or Die Trying logo. Link in the video's description. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.